You were innocent. The highest court in your country agrees. The president himself signs your pardon, and yet you are still locked in a cell. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. No charges, no trial, no justice. You scream into the silence, but the law doesn't answer because those who are supposed to uphold it refuse to act. This is not a fiction. This is not a thriller. This happened to Tengi Asanite, a man caught between law and honestness, right and might. His case would shake the foundations of European human rights law. Chapter 1: The Man and the Maze. Tengi Asanite was no stranger to power. A professor, a politician, and the mayor of Batumi, the capital of Ajaria, an autonomous region in Georgia. But in 1994, everything changed. Accused of illegal financial operations and firearms possession, he was convicted. But by 1999, the president of Georgia pardoned him. His record wiped, his debt to justice paid, except he wasn't released. The Ajarian authorities, defiant, semi-autonomous, and politically hostile, simply refused. They claimed he was too dangerous, that they didn't trust the pardon, so they kept him behind the bars. Then in 2000, as if by design, he was hit with new charges: kidnapping. He was convicted again, but in 2001, Georgia's Supreme Court struck down that conviction. A second time, the law said, he's free. A second time, Ajaria said, no. Chapter 2: A Country at War with Itself. Georgia's central government kept insisting it had done its part. The courts had ruled, the president had pardoned. What more could they do? Ajaria wasn't listening, but the European Court of Human Rights had a clear answer. You are the state, and the state is responsible everywhere, for everyone, whether the abuse happened in Tbilisi or Batumi, in a central agency or an autonomous region. The European Convention knows no exceptions, and so Georgia was brought before the court by Asanide, who had now been held for over 3 years after his acquittal. Chapter 3: The Legal Blowtorch. The Grand Chamber didn't just find procedural faults, it condemned Georgia. Under Article 5, Clause 1, the right to liberty and security, the court ruled that Asanide's continued detention had no legal basis. He was not awaiting trial. He was not serving a sentence. He was simply held. Under Article 6, Clause 1, the right to a fair trial, the court stated that if judgments are not enforced, justice is meaningless. A verdict without execution is just ink on paper. Georgia argued, but we tried. Ajaria is autonomous. The court responded sharply. International law doesn't care about your internal dysfunctions. You are bound to deliver what you are signed up for. In other words, if you can't control your regions, you still carry the consequences. Accountability cannot be outsourced. Chapter 4: The Verdict and its Echo. Before we look at the judgment itself, let's briefly retrace the legal path that brought Tengi Asanide here. It began in 1994 with a conviction in Batumi for economic offences and firearms possession. The Supreme Court of Georgia upheld the conviction in 1995, but in 1999, Asanide received a presidential pardon. Theoretically, that should have ended his imprisonment. Instead, the Ajarian authorities refused to release him, and just months later, they filed new charges: kidnapping, for which he was convicted by Azarian High Court in 2000. In 2001, the Supreme Court of Georgia acquitted him completely, ordering his immediate release. Yet, despite two decisive rulings, one from the executive, the other from the judiciary, Ajaria defied them both. With no further recourse under Georgian law, Hasanideh appealed to European Courts of Human Rights. On April 2004, the Grand Chamber of the European Courts of Human Rights, in a 14-3 ruling, delivered a powerful and precedent-setting judgment. First, the court held unanimously that Article 5, Clause 1 of the European Convention had been violated. Hasanideh had been unlawfully detained for over 3 years after his acquittal. There was no legal justification, no statutory basis. His detention was arbitrary and illegal. Second, by 14 votes to 3, the court found a violation of Article 6, Clause 1, the right to a fair hearing. Why? Because a judgment that is not enforced is no justice at all. The court emphasized, a state cannot allow its judicial decisions to be rendered meaningless by local defiance. Georgia tried to argue that central government had no control over Ajaria, but the court was clear. Decentralization cannot excuse human rights violation. If a state ratifies the convention, it is responsible for ensuring compliance throughout its territory, even in regions governed by autonomous authorities. Finally, Article 41 of the convention, the court awarded €150,000 in damages for pecuniary and non-pecuniary harm and €5,000 for legal costs. But more significantly, the court issued a rare directive. Georgia must secure Hasanideh's release without delay, and it did. After years of unlawful detention, Tengi Hasanideh was finally freed, not by domestic justice, but by international law compelling national accountability. Chapter 5: The Legacy. The case of Hasanideh versus Georgia sent shockwaves through international legal circles. It became a defining precedent for how the European courts interprets jurisdiction and the state responsibility. The ruling affirmed that human rights obligations apply to the entire territory of a state, whether or not the central government claims control over every corner. In other words, you can delegate power, but not responsibility. It also elevated the principle that justice must be enforceable. An acquittal that can be ignored by a rogue region undermines not only individual liberty but the very authority of a legal system. Since 2004, Hasanideh versus Georgia had been cited in numerous cases involving regional disobedience, unlawful detention, and failure to enforce judicial decisions. Tengi Hasanideh's story is not just about one man's imprisonment. It's a case that exposed the fragile thread between law and liberty, between autonomy and accountability, and in the end, it reminded us all that freedom doesn't come from words on paper, but from a system that insists those words be honored. Justice is not just a verdict, it's what happens after the verdict, and sometimes it takes the roar of international law to open the doors that national silence leaves shut. This was the story of Hasanideh versus Georgia.